A routine protection shift suddenly turns into a full-scale royal emergency when Sergeant Thomas Wright notices a silent child distress alert flicker alive on his terminal. Instinct kicks in. What seems like a minor system glitch quickly reveals something far severe. The alarm was not loud, it was not dramatic, and that was what made it terrifying. The signal was never supposed to activate. It was buried inside layers of protocol, concealed behind permissions most guards never even knew existed. A last resort, a child's last breath of control when everything else failed. Thomas Wright stared at it as if it were a mistake. His tea sat cooling beside the keyboard, untouched. His fingers hovered over the keys. His heartbeat slowed the way it always did before impact. Then the icon flashed again. Twice meant danger, not confusion, not curiosity. Danger. And somewhere in this protected residence, a 9-year-old princess had just pressed a secret lifeline twice within 7 minutes. He reached for his radio and hesitated, because the instant the second signal arrived, another message appeared on his screen. Quiet, formal, unmistakable. Stand down. Someone did not want him to respond, and before the morning was over, he would be staring at a door that was never meant to be kicked in, with one question burning through every rule he had ever sworn to follow. If the system meant to protect a child fails, who did you trust? 3 hours earlier, the morning had begun like any other inside the private residence wing, the sort of royal environment designed to feel ordinary while being anything but. The stone corridors were polished until they held a muted reflection of the ceiling lamps. The air carried that familiar mixture of old limestone, expensive polish, and faint floral cleaning solution. It was quiet in the way only heavily secured buildings were quiet, with every sound measured and absorbed, every footstep softened by long carpets and thick doors. Sergeant Thomas Wright had served in the Royal Guard for 22 years, and his body had begun to wear those years the way stone wore weather. He was broad-shouldered, built like someone who once carried heavy kit over bad ground, and his face had the weathered lines of a man who had spent long stretches outdoors and longer stretches awake. His hair was clipped close, habit more than vanity, and his eyes held the steady focus of someone who had learned that danger rarely announced itself properly. Before royal protection, he had been in infantry. Before that, simply a boy who wanted to belong to something that demanded discipline. He had watched friends freeze under pressure, watched others become reckless, and he had survived by becoming neither. Rule-bound, yes, but not blind. Instinct-driven, always, especially when children were involved. That part of him was older than the uniform. He did not speak about it. He did not have to. It showed in the way he watched the younger staff move, in the way his gaze softened by a fraction whenever Princess Charlotte passed with her nanny, her school bag bouncing lightly against her back. He never stared, never smiled too openly. That was not his role. But he noticed. He always noticed. On that particular morning, the sky outside had been overcast, pressing a grey light through tall windows that overlooked private gardens and hedges trimmed to ceremonial perfection. The palace felt sealed off from the rest of the world, as if the clouds had decided to lower themselves over it like a lid. Wright began his shift the way he always did. Checkpoint walk, sensor status checks, manual log confirmations. He moved with quiet purpose, the kind that did not draw attention, but commanded it. At each secure door, he let his gloved fingers rest briefly on the cold brass, feeling for warmth, for vibration, for anything that suggested recent movement. At each camera junction, he listened to the low hum of the security systems behind the walls, that constant electrical murmur that had become as familiar to him as his own breathing.
Inside the control nook at the end of the residence wing, he checked the digital logs and the old-fashioned paper ledger kept for redundancy. The ledger smelled of ink and binding glue, as if the palace itself distrusted electronics enough to keep a backup in human handwriting. He preferred it that way. Machines failed. Ink did not. His tea was poured early, brewed strong, left on the edge of the desk while he checked feeds. It went cold more than it was finished. That was the job. The monitors displayed the same familiar views. Corridors empty, doors closed, staff moving with quiet efficiency. Nothing looked wrong, nothing sounded wrong. Yet there was a faint lag in the terminal that morning, a half-second delay when he pulled up the access history for the child corridor. It was subtle, the sort of thing most people would blame on an update or a harmless glitch. Wright did not believe in harmless glitches in royal security. He ran the query again. The screen loaded slightly slower, the cursor stuttering as if the machine were thinking too hard. He compared it with the paper log. The names matched, the times matched, but the system's internal tick rate was off by a fraction. Then he saw it. A door sensor reading open for 0.4 seconds. Not long enough for someone to step through properly, too short to be a genuine passage, but long enough to suggest a physical disturbance. A door touched, a latch engaged, something tested. The corridor in question served the child wing. It was restricted even among restricted staff. Only a small number of personnel had clearance to pass beyond the final brass-paneled door that separated the family's private living area from the operational corridors. Thomas Wright's eyes narrowed. His hand moved without thought, pulling up the sensor's associated camera feed. The feed showed nothing, just the corridor, empty and perfectly lit. The wallpaper pattern did not shift, no shadow passed, no door moved. He checked the timestamp alignment again, feeling his own focus sharpen the way it always did when something did not add up. In 22 years, he had seen doors forced, he had seen alarms triggered, he had seen drunk visitors wander into restricted halls, he had seen fans attempt foolish stunts, but he had almost never seen a sensor register open without a corresponding visual record. It was a system error that should not exist. Wright sat back, slow, controlled, letting the unease settle into him like cold water. He did not yet know why it mattered. He only knew that it did. He took one sip of his tea. It was cold and bitter. He set it down. He made a note in the paper ledger, the pen scratching quietly. Terminal lag, sensor anomaly, corridor camera check. Then, at exactly 9:23 in the morning, the icon appeared. Not an alarm bell, not a siren, a silent, discreet symbol in the corner of the security dashboard, one that would not draw attention from anyone trained to look for it. A silent child distress alert tied to a biometric trigger, designed to be activated by Princess Charlotte Elizabeth Diana Windsor and almost no one else. Wright stared at it. His mind attempted to reject it, not because he doubted the system, because he understood it too well. That signal was engineered to be nearly impossible to activate accidentally. It required a specific pattern, a deliberate trigger. It was the kind of safeguard you built when you feared the unthinkable. The signal was never supposed to activate. He felt the shift in his body before he moved, the moment when training took over and emotion was pushed back behind duty. His breathing slowed, his shoulders settled, his hands became steady. He leaned closer to the screen, reading the confirmation data. Biometric match, subject, Princess Charlotte, location tag, child wing interior, integrity, valid. His fingers hovered over the radio switch. Then he paused, listening, because one thing he had learned in combat and one thing he had learned here is that silence can contain more information than noise. If this was real, there would be a hint of it in the building itself, a sound out of place, a rhythm interrupted. He heard only the low hum of the systems, the faint whir of a ventilation fan, distant footsteps echoing somewhere far down the marble halls, perhaps a staff member beginning their day. No raised voices, no running, no obvious crisis. That was what frightened him most. Wright rose from his chair. He moved toward the corridor access door at the end of the nook, his boots quiet on the carpet. The air felt different, charged with tension that had no visible source. He placed his hand on the cold brass handle and felt no warmth. It had not been touched recently. He entered the corridor slowly, head turning slightly, eyes scanning the corners, the ceiling, the seams where panels met stone. The marble floors gleamed in the pale morning light filtering through tall windows, casting long shadows.
Not later in the day, not in some delayed panic. It came within 7 minutes of the first, pulsing on his terminal back in the control nook, but mirrored through the wearable interface under his sleeve. His wrist unit vibrated once, then again, as if the system itself were pressing urgency into his skin. Twice meant danger. Wright's mouth went dry. He stared at the door in front of him. The corridor beyond remained silent. He whispered without meaning to, barely audible, as if speaking the words might make them real. This is not possible. But it was. His training told him to follow procedure, confirm through command, alert supervisory control, lock down the corridor, initiate the child wing protocol with authorization. His instincts told him there was no time, because 2 signals were not a child playing. 2 signals were a child trying again because the first attempt had not brought help, because someone had ignored it. He stepped back, forced himself to breathe. 1 breath, 2. He did not rush the door, not yet. He checked the manual lock indicator at the base, a secondary mechanical status bar that showed whether the internal bolts were engaged. It read secure. He ran his clearance card. The reader blinked green. The lock clicked, then stopped. A second click followed, like a hesitation. A faint grinding sound, almost imperceptible, like metal catching. Wright's froze. A lock should not hesitate. He pulled the door gently, testing. It opened a fraction, not enough to pass, but enough to prove that the bolts had not been fully engaged. His heart began to thud harder, no longer calm, but controlled by sheer force of discipline. He did not open the door fully. He closed it again softly and took 2 steps back. He lifted his wrist and brought the internal interface up. The corridor camera feed. It loaded. It froze. Not the usual stutter, not a brief lag. The image held still for 11 seconds, the timecode still moving, while the hallway remained unnaturally frozen, as if reality itself had paused. Then it resumed. Wright's skin prickled under his uniform. A frozen feed meant one thing. Someone had interfered. They had either cut the signal and replaced it with a still frame, or they had delayed it enough to create a blind pocket of time. A blind pocket was all a skilled insider needed. Wright returned to the control nook at a pace that was brisk but not frantic, because panic made noise, and noise made mistakes. He pulled up the access logs for the child wing door. He compared them to the paper ledger again. There should have been a sign-off for any staff member entering or exiting, a guard's confirmation, a dual authorization, a reason recorded. There was none. The sensor had registered open for 0.4 seconds earlier. The feed had frozen for 11 seconds now. The distress signal had triggered twice, and yet the system's main incident console showed nothing flagged, nothing escalated, nothing forwarded to command. Someone had filtered it. Someone had concealed it. Wright moved through menus that most guards never touched. He accessed the emergency subsystem, the hidden layer designed for extreme contingencies.
His fingers moved quickly, sure, as if he had practiced this 1,000 times in his head. He pulled up the child signal history. Signal 1, confirmed. Signal 2, confirmed. Both valid. He checked the alert routing table. It was blank. No dispatch record, no acknowledgement log, no automatic escalation. It was as if the system had been told to accept the signal and then do nothing. Wright stared at the screen until his eyes blurred slightly. Then he blinked hard and forced himself to think. Who could alter routing tables? Who could suppress a distress signal without tripping tamper alarms? Only someone with senior administrative access. Only someone inside the system. His radio crackled softly at his hip, a routine update from another wing. Ordinary, calm, oblivious. Wright's hand moved to the radio, then stopped again. Because if the insider was still present, any open broadcast could alert them that he had noticed. He needed to act, but he needed to act quietly. He pulled up the guard roster for the child wing that morning. Only 2 names were authorized to be near the child's quarters during school preparation time, besides family staff. One was his, by virtue of senior oversight. The other was a younger guard assigned to perimeter monitoring. That guard's sign-off was missing. Wright's jaw tightened. He checked the guard's location tag. Offline. Not radio silent. Offline, as if the tag had been removed or the battery had been cut. A chill crawled up Wright's spine. He stood, grabbed his kit, and moved with purpose down the corridor toward the child wing. His footsteps were quiet. His mind, however, was roaring. While Wright moved, Princess Charlotte sat in a room she did not recognize, trying to remember every lesson she had ever been taught about staying calm. She did not scream. She had been told not to scream unless she had to. Screaming made adults loud, and loud adults made mistakes. She had been told to breathe and look and listen. The room smelled of dust and disinfectant. The lights were dim. A chair sat too close to the door, as if someone had tried to block it without making it obvious. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, fingers gripping each other so hard her knuckles looked pale. There was a small device on her wrist, disguised as a decorative band. She had pressed it once when she first realized she was not walking toward school, when the corridor turned the wrong way, when the door she knew led to the gardens was passed without stopping, when the familiar faces around her seemed different, too still, too rehearsed. Nothing had happened. So she had pressed it again 7 minutes later, after she had been moved through a service passage and into a vehicle that smelled of leather and cold metal. She had pressed it again because she had begun to understand that the system might not be listening, and in that moment her fear had become something sharper: determination. Back in the palace, Wright approached the child wing door again. He did not swipe his card this time. He knelt and examined the lock housing itself. There was an alteration. A slight misalignment in the metal casing, like it had been prized open and then reseated. A tiny ridge where the smooth brass should have been flush. His fingers traced it gently, feeling the imperfection. He pulled a small torch from his pocket and angled the beam into the seam. Inside, just visible, was a faint smear, dark, greasy, manual override residue. Someone had used a mechanical tool to bypass the electronic lock, then wiped it down quickly, but not carefully enough to remove every trace. Wright's throat tightened. He rose and looked up at the camera in the corner of the corridor. It stared back, impassive, red indicator light steady. He knew with an awful clarity that someone with the right access could make that camera lie. He pushed the radio button now, briefly, using an encrypted channel reserved for senior alerts. Control requested immediate confirmation of child wing status. The response came too quickly. Stand down. Situation under internal review. No explanation, no query, no question. Just stand down. Wright felt his blood run cold. He tried again, more direct. requesting command authorization to enter child wing due to confirmed distress signal. There was a pause, a hiss of static. Then a voice, controlled and firm, gave him what sounded like an order and what felt like a threat. Sergeant Wright, you are instructed to hold position. Do not escalate. Wright stared at the door. His mind raced, reconstructing the last hour. At 8:05 that morning, a forged authorization could have been submitted. At 8:15, an unauthorized vehicle could have entered the grounds under legitimate clearance. At 8:17, Princess Charlotte's last confirmed visual could have been logged in the corridor outside her quarters. At 20:23, a vehicle could have departed with tinted windows, its route approved by someone above question. And then, at exactly 9:23 in the morning, the child herself triggered the secret signal, twice. Wright began piecing it together the way he had pieced together ambushes in dusty provinces, the way he had reconstructed improvised explosive attacks after the smoke cleared. Time was a weapon, so was paperwork. He moved to the nearest service corridor that connected to the child wing indirectly, a route used by maintenance staff and cleaning personnel, often ignored because it was considered low risk. The door required a higher clearance. He had it. He entered, the air immediately cooler, smelling of metal and faint damp. The lighting was harsher, the walls were utilitarian. The palace's elegance vanished here, replaced by the hidden skeleton that kept it running. He moved quickly, scanning the floor, and then he found it. A small fabric fiber caught on the edge of a conduit panel, blue and white, the kind used in school uniforms. It was tiny, almost nothing, but it should not have been there in a maintenance corridor. Wright's hand.
Next to the backpack was another clue, more disturbing, a torn piece of fabric, the same blue and white, a jagged rip, as if it had been pulled in a struggle. Wright photographed that too, his mind now fully convinced that this was not a misunderstanding. This was a removal. And removals inside royal security almost never came from outsiders. Outsiders could not get this close. He returned to the control nook, locked the door behind him, and began the methodical work of an investigation that had to be done in minutes. He accessed the lock system's diagnostic files. He searched for RFID trace logs. There was an RFID mismatch. The child wing door had recorded an authorized card swipe that matched a clearance level, but the unique chip signature did not match any issued card in the system. It was as if someone had cloned a card's access level and used it with a different chip identity, a sophisticated trick that required insider knowledge and specialist equipment. Wright stared at the screen. It could not be, but it was. Someone with palace authorization had forged the credentials. No one knew, no one suspected, no one could have predicted what happened next. He pulled up the video archive for the corridor outside Charlotte. The file opened. It showed the corridor at 8:41, clear and normal. Staff passed. A nanny moved with a tray. Nothing unusual. Then, at 9:02, the camera feed showed a brief delay. Not a freeze, a delay, like the file had been re-encoded, a digital fingerprint of tampering. Wright knew what to look for. Small shifts in compression artifacts, inconsistent frame rates, a sudden smoothing where raw footage should have been sharp. At 9:18, the access system showed a spike, multiple clearance checks in rapid succession, as if someone had tested a door repeatedly until it opened. Wright compared it to other days. That did not happen, not in this wing, not ever. At exactly 9:23 in the morning, the first distress signal had been triggered. At 9:30, the second signal had been triggered. Wright sat in silence for one long breath. Every safeguard had been overridden, and not by hacking from a basement somewhere, by legitimate authority. He began tracing the approvals.
Every clearance request had a signature trail, an office code, a supervisor approval tag. On paper, it looked clean, perfect, proper. But the pattern was too neat. All approvals traced back to one office, the office of the Senior Royal Security Administrator, the person responsible for managing the system's highest permissions, the person whose signature would never be questioned because it was the signature that kept the palace safe. A trusted insider. Wright's hand tightened around the edge of the desk until the skin beneath his glove ached. He wanted to call it kidnapping. That would be simple. That would mean an enemy, a villain with obvious malice. But the evidence suggested something else. Not kidnapping. Transfer. A movement of a protected child from one controlled location to another, using the system itself as the escort. Why would anyone transfer a princess without alerting full command? Why would they conceal it from the very people trained to protect her? Why would they suppress her distress signal? Wright's mind ran through possibilities that made his stomach churn. A threat assessment gone wrong, a secret protective relocation, a test, a power play, something worse. His radio buzzed again. "Stand down, Sergeant. This is handled." Handled. The word felt like a hand over his mouth. Wright's internal conflict rose like a storm. Protocol mattered. Procedures existed for a reason. Disobeying orders could destroy his career, his pension, his reputation. It could lead to dismissal. It could lead to charges. Royal security was not a field that forgave insubordination. But a child's distress signal went off twice, and someone made sure no one answered. He thought of Princess Charlotte's face when she waved to guards, her polite little nod, the way she always seemed to notice the people who were trained to not be noticed. He thought of her small shoulders under her uniform. He thought of how fragile it all was beneath the ceremony. If he was wrong, he would be finished. If he was right, she lived. He checked the GPS tracking tags assigned to secure vehicles. The system showed routine movements, but one anomaly stood out, a vehicle tag that went dark for 13 minutes and then reappeared with a location that made no sense for its declared route. The vehicle was a black Mercedes, an escort-class transport used for high-risk movements. Its identification matched a clearance entry earlier that morning. Its route was listed as maintenance relocation, but the reappearance coordinates were not at any maintenance depot. They were 3 miles away, near an off-grid estate building used for storage, a place that was technically still under royal property control, but rarely visited. Wright felt the moment of decision settle into him like a weight. He sent one message through the secure system, not to command, but to an old colleague who owed him a favor, a man stationed near the external gate. Check black Mercedes escort class vehicle, possible unauthorized movement. Do not alert command. Confirm discreetly. Then he did something he hadn't done in decades. He ignored the stand-down. He ignored the mandatory briefing request that flashed on his screen. He ignored every rule he had followed for 22 years. And he ran. He moved through corridors with the speed of a man who knew every shortcut, every hidden door, every place where cameras didn't quite reach. His boots struck stones softly. He kept to the edge of the hall where shadows pooled. He passed portraits of monarchs and queens, their painted eyes watching him as if judging what he was about to do. His radio crackled again, louder now, voices sharper. "Sergeant, you are out of position. Return immediately." Wright did not respond. He reached a locked checkpoint leading to the underground access route that connected the main residence wing to service tunnels. This checkpoint required dual authorization. His clearance alone was not enough. He stared at the reader panel, feeling time press against his ribs. He disabled the security lock. Not with brute force, with knowledge, with a small override key he had been issued years ago for emergency maintenance, a key that was supposed to be used only under command supervision. He inserted it, turned it, and felt the internal mechanism release with a quiet click. The door opened. He stepped through. "I am going in," he murmured, not for anyone else, but for himself, as if speaking the commitment made it harder to retreat. The tunnels were colder, the air damp, smelling of concrete and old pipes. The sound of his breathing seemed loud in the confined space. He moved quickly, guided by memory and by the GPS coordinates glowing faintly on his wrist unit. Above ground, while Wright moved unseen, the black Mercedes rolled along a narrow service lane, its tinted windows revealing nothing. Inside, Princess Charlotte sat stiffly, her heart pounding, her mind running through everything she had been taught. If you are taken somewhere, remember smells, remember sounds, remember turns. She counted them silently. Left, right, straight, a bump, another bump. The car stopped. A door opened. A voice spoke softly, almost kindly, which made it worse. "You are safe. This is for your protection." Charlotte did not believe it, not because the voice sounded cruel, but because the voice sounded too certain, too controlling. Inside the underground route, Wright reached a service exit that opened near the off-grid estate building. He paused at the threshold, listening. The outside air was colder, the sky still heavy with cloud. The building ahead was low and unremarkable, designed to blend into the landscape of royal property infrastructure. It looked abandoned. It looked harmless. That was what made it perfect. A black Mercedes was parked outside. Same vehicle identification, same tinted windows. Wright's jaw clenched. He moved silently, years of training taking over. Assess the threat, locate the subject, secure the perimeter. He circled the building, keeping to the edge of hedges and stone walls. He noted a camera mounted above a side door, but its indicator light was off. Either it was broken, or it had been disabled deliberately. He approached a small window. The glass was grimy. He wiped a corner with his sleeve, leaving a clear patch. Inside, the room was lit by a single lamp. He saw a chair, a table, a child's small silhouette sitting very still, and a woman
He stepped back, feet planted, body angled. He inhaled once, deep, feeling every year of training align inside him like a mechanism. Then he kicked. One strike, precise, powerful. The door exploded inward. Wood splintered, the lock shattered. The building's internal alarm, long dormant, screamed to life in a sudden cascade, echoing through the estate like a wounded animal. Wright moved through the doorway like a storm, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the room. "Royal Guard, step away from the child." The woman spun, shock flickering across her face before transforming into cold anger. She was impeccably dressed, her hair neat, her expression controlled even in crisis, as if she believed she was entitled to remain composed. "You have no authority here, Sergeant," she said, voice sharp now, stripped of its briefing room warmth. "I have every authority," Wright replied, his voice steady, carrying the weight of an oath that did not require permission. "Princess Charlotte, come to me now." Charlotte stared for one stunned second, as if her mind could not quite believe what her eyes were seeing. Then she stood so fast, her chair scraped the floor, and she ran. Her small shoes slapped against the concrete. Her breath hitched. Her eyes were wide. Wright dropped to one knee, arms open, making himself smaller, safer, a human shield rather than a towering figure of authority. Charlotte ran straight into Wright's protective stance. "You are okay," he said softly, his voice gentler now, meant only for her. "I have got you." Her hands clutched his uniform, her body trembled. She did not cry loudly, she tried not to, but her breath shook and her face pressed against his shoulder as if she needed proof that he was real. Behind them, the woman took a step forward, palms raised, not in surrender, but in insistence. "You are ruining everything," she said, voice tightening with something that sounded almost desperate. "You do not understand. This was protection through control. The threat was inside. I moved her before it reached her." Wright kept his body between the woman and the child. His eyes did not leave the administrator's face. "And you suppressed her distress signal, twice. You altered locks, you edited logs, you removed a guard from the system. That is not protection, that is abduction." The woman's composure cracked for a moment. Not fear, not guilt, conviction. "She would have been harmed," she insisted. "I did what command would not do fast enough. I did what had to be done." Wright's radio crackled, suddenly alive with frantic voices, alarm notifications, and the distant sound of approaching vehicles. Someone had finally noticed the cascade. He held Charlotte tighter, feeling the coldness of the room seep into his knees. "You do not get to decide that alone," he said. The woman's eyes flashed. "You think this ends here? You think the palace is clean? It is not." Wright's grip tightened, not on Charlotte, but on the truth of what he had seen. Moments later, armed personnel arrived, then police, then senior officials who moved with urgent, controlled chaos. The woman was restrained, her protests fading into the noise of procedure. Charlotte was guided carefully outside, wrapped in a coat, shielded from cameras and eyes. As they moved her towards safety, Charlotte looked up at Wright, her face pale, her voice barely above a whisper. "You came. I knew you would." Wright swallowed, feeling emotion press against his throat in a way he could not afford to show publicly. "Always," he said. "That's the oath we take." Days later, the palace did not speak publicly about what had happened. That was how it worked. Silence was part of the institution's armor. But inside, behind closed doors, the consequences fell like heavy rain. Sergeant Thomas Wright stood before a review board in a room that smelled of polished wood and old authority. Men and women in tailored suits sat behind a long table, their expressions measured. A flag stood in the corner. A portrait of a monarch watched from the wall. Everything about the room said order, procedure, tradition. Wright stood straight, uniform immaculate, face unreadable, but inside he felt the weight of what he had done. He had broken 17 protocols, he had bypassed command, he had disabled a lock, he had forced entry on royal property without authorization. Any one of those actions could end a career. Together, they could destroy a man. The board chairperson looked at him for a long moment. "Sergeant, your actions were highly irregular. Under normal circumstances, this would result in immediate dismissal." Wright did not flinch. He had accepted that possibility the second he ran. Then the chairperson's tone shifted slightly, not softer, but different, as if acknowledging that the world did not always fit into rules. "However, these were not normal circumstances. Your instincts, your courage, and your dedication to protecting the royal family likely prevented a national crisis. You are hereby commended for bravery beyond the call of duty." Wright felt a slow release in his chest, not relief exactly, but validation. He kept his face neutral. That was discipline. That was the job. But inside, something loosened, something that had been clenched since the second distress signal.
The senior royal security administrator was charged, removed, and placed under investigation for unauthorized transfer, tampering with security systems, and endangering a protected child. The inquiry revealed how she had exploited legitimate authority, how she had used the system's trust as a weapon. It was chilling, it was disturbing, it was devastating in its simplicity. Following the incident, palace security protocols underwent massive revision. Vehicle authorizations now required biometric verification from multiple independent offices. Emergency signals were upgraded so they could not be rerouted without triggering external oversight. A direct hotline to senior guards was established, removing the possibility of a single administrator silencing a child's call for help. Yet even as reforms were announced, Wright could not shake the thought that had lodged itself deep in him. If one trusted insider could do this, how many others could? Later that evening, Wright returned to his small quarters, a quiet space within the guarded complex. The room was simple: a bed, a desk, a framed photograph of his regiment years ago. He sat down, the day's exhaustion settling into his bones like lead. A knock came to the door. He opened it to find an envelope placed neatly on the floor, no messenger in sight. The stationery was plain, but the seal was unmistakably royal. Wright sat at the desk and opened it carefully, as if it might vanish if he moved too quickly. Inside was a handwritten letter, a child's handwriting, slightly uneven, earnest. Dear Sergeant Wright, thank you for finding me. Thank you for keeping your promise. You are my hero. Love, Charlotte. Wright stared at the words until his eyes stung. He folded the letter carefully, once, then again, making the creases perfect. He placed it in his pocket, close to his chest, where it would not be damaged. In 22 years of service, he had protected kings, queens, princes, and princesses, but he had never felt more proud than in that moment. Because duty was not just rules. Protocol mattered, training mattered, experience mattered. But sometimes you had to trust your instincts and do what was right, even when it cost everything. What Sergeant Thomas Wright did not know yet was that this incident was not isolated. In the days that followed, as investigators dug through archived clearances and hidden permissions, they discovered other overrides that did not make sense, other approvals that had been granted too easily, other logs that had been edited with the same careful hand. And beyond these walls, beyond this palace, in 3 other royal residences across Europe, quiet reports were beginning to surface. Disappearances that lasted minutes or hours, brushed aside as misunderstandings, smoothed over by authority, each one involving a child, each one involving a trusted insider, each one hidden behind the polished surface of tradition. The haunting question remained, sharper now than ever. If the system meant to protect a child could be turned against her, who could you trust? This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. It does not depict real events involving the British royal family. Subscribe to Crown Watch for more untold palace stories. What should we investigate next? Comment below.